All right. You good if I take first question?
Of course.
All right. So let's start on the GCC, right? You say the GCC has seen a momentary resurgence. What did the GCC do during this resurgence?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so we don't know what the GCC did.
Sure, but we would say that insofar as it increased its effectiveness during the period of resurgence, obviously that's a benefit, even if there is no substantial policy passed.
Okay, so we see meaningless increases in regional organizations and somehow that
Sure.
prevents wars. I don't think that makes a lot of sense.
Well, no, I wouldn't say it's meaningless, right? If the Gulf states are working together, even if they're not passing any substantial commitments, that probably means they're not actively going to war with each other.
Okay, sure. You can have a question.
Sure. So let's talk about Iraq right now. Are we increasing our diplomacy in Iraq or decreasing it?
I'm not sure. You can tell me.
Yeah, so we're decreasing our diplomacy right now in Iraq, but the conflict is still decreasing as we speak. So why do we need more diplomacy if it's already decreasing?
Our evidence concludes that the country is likely to spill over a civil war. So I don't know what evidence you have about the conflict probability.
Wait, so how is the country still in a civil war if like 7 years ago, 20,000 people were dying a year and now it's in the hundreds for the last few years, like again and again and again? So what is the likelihood? Why do you indicate, like, what does your evidence say is the reason as to why there's going to be another civil conflict?
Yeah, so our argument is, so our evidence concludes that because there's likely going to be a stalemate between the two sides, it could likely lead, it likely leads to increased resentment in the long term if there's a stalemate, right? There's like no progress at all in the conflict.
Okay, if there's no progress, okay, you can have a question. I mean,
okay, so let's talk about the Velasco evidence, right, about regional organizations. Does the Velasco evidence say the United States can't be a part of regional organizations?
I mean, if the U.S. isn't in the region, then obviously the U.S. can't be part of a regional organization.
That's definitely not true, right? A regional organization, as long as it's primarily like with countries in the specific region, I don't see why the U.S. can't be part.
I mean, if it's a regional organization, then if the U.S. isn't in the region, it probably becomes an international organization, which our evidence is telling you is probably bad. And the warranting is still there from both of our links. We tell you the U.S. has obviously a different perspective and a different bias on all these conflicts than the actual mediators in the conflict, which is why regional organizations have a vested interest and thus are more likely to succeed.
Okay, sure. You can have a question.
Cool. So let's talk about United States hedge, right? So you tell me that right now the U.S.'s credibility in the Middle East is decreasing. What materially does this look like?
It means the U.S. is like less likely to provide any kind of commitments to our allies in the region.
Sure. Like what has happened?
I'm confused as to what you're asking. We're providing less commitments to allies in the region.
Yeah. And what has happened?
Like our evidence concludes that we're likely to see escalation because of it.
Sure. Our evidence indicates that when we decrease our commitments, historically, we've seen a decrease in airstrikes in Saudi Arabia. So if your evidence isn't giving examples of where decreased credibility has led to increase in conflict, obviously, historically, it's beneficial for the NEG.
Okay, well, airstrike specific, like, yeah, we'll contest in rebuttal. That's like time anyway.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Wait, cool. Okay. Are we taking prep in the like one random Discord call? I don't know.
Yeah, we can take some prep. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that was like 10 seconds used. Or should we straight down? Is everyone good? Okay, cool. Let me get my document set up and I'll be good to go. At the top, on their first commitment to sanctions, it's fundamentally not unique. That's because since the start of the conflict, the U.S. has been conducting sanctions on almost every facet of the Syrian economy. Increasing diplomacy changes nothing since these sanctions are already in place. But second of all, sanctions are actually good. That's because the pressure that sanctions put on government resources stop countries from directly engaging in war. As Peshko-10 confirms that economic sanctions produce a drop of 8% in the probability of future disputes, but for this turn for two reasons. First, in severity, conflicts kill millions, which is much worse than the impacts of poverty from sanctions. And second of all, it solves the root cause, because the reason these states are in conflict and war and poverty in the first place is because of conflict. So we solve back for the root cause of the war. Then, second of all, sanctions only fail because of a lack of diplomacy. Increasing talks is the only way to make them work. O'Toole finds that over time, sanctions work when combined with broader diplomatic efforts. Sanctions must be used as part of a comprehensive and executable strategy to achieve U.S. policy goals. Third, diplomacy increases aid, as Case21 writes that prioritizing steps to contain conflict through reinvigorated diplomacy is backed by assistance to stem suffering and the prospect of destabilizing mass migration. Relatively quantifies that foreign aid is expected to raise growth rates per capita by 1% on average, and Monet concludes that a 1% increase in income reduces poverty by 0.16%. Prefer aid over sanctions for two reasons. First is probability. This is the most likely implementation of the resolution. Maybe generally sanctions and diplomacy go together, but specifically when it comes to doing diplomacy within the context of conflict resolution, we use foreign aid, not sanctions. Second of all, aid is given directly to the people who need it most, whereas sanctions are generally targeted at corrupt individuals, not those in poverty. Then, on their second contention, at the top, 3 reasons why there won't be cooperation. Heller20 writes that first, trust between governments is rare and a lack of national identity or acceptance of statehood historically characterizes the Arab countries. Second, Arab leaders learned that unity was a device for Arab leaders to boost their own positions, but these are not sincere requests for cooperation. Instead, they serve as a claim of hegemony. Third, centuries of religious tensions destroy any chance of long-term trust, really even absent U.S. support, there was conflict in 2006. Empirics prove the diplomacy that they talk about has already failed. TNF finds just 1 week ago that diplomatic talks between regional rivals Iran and Saudi Arabia have come to a halt, and CFAR finds that as Iran advances its nuclear program and trains proxy forces throughout the Middle East, the potential for conflict continues to increase. For our evidence over theirs, because all of their evidence is written before ours written. Ours posted, it says that even if their diplomacy could have worked, it has already failed because of the historical tension is the actual analysis on the actor incentive level. Then, I would say that affirming sauce. Opportunity refers to the United States diplomatic engagement opens doors in the goal for media, greases the wheel of deal making, and Washington also promote a format for settlement discussions. That's why there was a ceasefire in Yemen before. It only failed because the U.S. disengaged again, which is another reason why affirming is uniquely key. Specifically on their first link, a greater emphasis on diplomacy will help the U.S. demilitarize approach to the Middle Eastern countries, as Goldberger21 writes that a new approach for the Middle East based on diplomacy, based on de-escalation, instead of focusing on regime change, could reduce U.S. military presence in the region. This means the U.S. will no longer focus on security guarantees, but rather shift to a new approach that emphasizes diplomacy, which takes other link. Second of all, absent U.S. commitments, you see the dethroning of the U.S. as a global hedge fund triggering our second tensions. Third, absent commitments, allies lash out in fear. Goldberg 17 finds a lack of trust in the U.S. led the Saudi Arabians to begin acting more aggressively out of insecurity, arming groups in Syria, intervening Bahrain, and launch the intervention in Yemen. That causes multiple wars to the region that at best they mitigate the impact, and it definitely outweighs their small impact because maybe they do a small decrease in drone strikes, but overall wars go up. Fourth of all, the ideologies of factors that inhibit cooperation are intrinsic to things like religion, not U.S. intervention. Fifth, their Parsi evidence indicates that negotiations were only possible because commitments were leveraged to force allies to the table. Diplomacy is only possible in the informative world. On their second link, first, Pomper, the top of this convention, indicates the U.S. opens the door for other third-party actors, so it's not U.S. mediation specifically that's picking sides. It also means the U.S. will no longer pick sides because instead it will play a supporting role, allowing the involved parties to delegate amongst themselves in their own interests. Her firm probability, Shapiro finds is the only form of diplomacy that will receive bipartisan support, since both Democrats and Republicans no longer support interventionist postures after the war on terror. Second, it's a contrast there. Firstly, either they believe in the U.S. and get emboldened, or they don't. Third, affirming restores the U.S.'s commitment to peace. Indic 06 finds that the choice to increase future participation will be read as signs of U.S. diplomatic commitment and creativity. Lastly, the Velasco evidence don't embellish general analysis of regional organizations, but our evidence finds that specifically in the Middle East, regional systems don't work. That's because Heller20 writes that trust between governments is rare. Regional institutions have failed to unwillingness to empower or enforce arrangements because they do not trust their neighbors in the Middle East specifically.
Can you tell me what the third response on the second link is? Or you can send me a doc, whatever works for you.
The doc is in the drive, but it says that the choice to increase future peace negotiations will be read as a sign of U.S. diplomatic commitment, creativity, and more fundamental our commitment to Arab-Israeli peace process.
Sure. Okay, I'll open the doc as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. It's going to be frontlining, so responding to what they said and then going to their case. Everyone ready? Cool. Let's start the time now. Go to our argument on sanctions. They say sanctions will always exist, but they've conceded our comparative. Sanctions only get worse in a world where you use it with diplomacy because there's now mutual interest in putting those sanctions in the first place. They say there's actually pressure to start war and sanctions solved, but clearly this is not true with Russia right now. Sanctions aren't solving the conflict. If anything, you only see a more emboldened Russia and other countries to pick up the arms to fight against the United States, because when we go into their own issues, we are seen as an imperialist country that only becomes aggressive, and now we have a new reason for them to fight us. They say you need talks, but talks don't even solve it in the first place. As long as there are sanctions being imposed, you want to create new economic recessions that happen, but to create more incentives for countries to be against the United States. They say diplomacy increases aid. You can turn this argument against them, because the aid we give to these governments are usually authoritarian governments and never go down to the people, and in fact only increase inequality and widen disparities. At that point, they've conceded our evidence right now that sanctions have failed in Syria to stop any conflicts and to put 90% of the population below the poverty line. If you want to vote for that world, you can vote for my opponents, but given that economic inequality and economic recession creates the breeding ground for terrorism and inequality that they talk about during a conflict, we are winning this debate. Let's go to our second argument on diplomacy. Again, they say a lot of things that don't hold up in the real world. For example, they say right now it's failing, but they fail to neglect that right now deaths from terrorism is going down by a bunch, and right now the Iraqi conflict is subsiding. All of this points to in a world where the United States should not intervene and should not go more into the Middle East. But second, the comparative is far worse, because even if you buy every single thing they say, they've conceded that A, our allies are more emboldened, who have no jurisdiction to actually go into the Middle East, and two, regional alliances fall apart. The reason this is important is because regional alliances are countries working together in the Middle East who actually understand each other's issues, where the United States is an imperialist country that has no actual ambition to help them. For example, they say that we need more talks and that it only worked when the US had pressure, but the Banam evidence is specific. US pressure will only work if there are no US presence in the Middle East whatsoever, which is why on the whole, regional diplomacy fails in their world. Let's go to their case. At the top, US foreign policy is incredibly weak. As Coral 19 explains, historically the US has never fully committed to its foreign policy goal. From deployments in Libya in 2011 to disengagement right now, uncertainty has been triggered in the region as in flux because of things like populism, nationalism, and high-cost diplomacy. This means A, the perception of U.S. foreign policy isn't sustainable in the long term and never solves for their objectives, and two, U.S. foreign policy itself is never long term, which short circuits every single argument they read. Go to Iraq. First, Iraq started increasing diplomacy to solve the issue. As Hussein 22 explains, it's arranging Iranian dialogue with Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE, and also solving as a neutral actor. That's why the federal government reported that deaths from this conflict has gone down by 25% in the status quo. We show you their sovereignty. Second, the issue only gets worse in their world. As Benam 20 explains, efforts to limit proliferation and solve conflicts are all filling a void that is too often filled by the United States, concluding that while U.S. support is appreciated, there should be no Americans whatsoever. This makes sense because the U.S. has been seen as an imperial aggressor and a problem in the country. That's why the Sunni and Shia conflict have always existed, but pre- and post-U.S. intervention have only boiled over with U.S. presence. Then go to their second argument on the Middle East. Again, this argument doesn't make a lot of sense in the real world. Right now, Graziano 18 explains, owing to the relative decline of the U.S. economy and military, the U.S. no longer has the same flexibility it once did, which is why going back into the Middle East only triggers a more imperial overstretch where we cannot solve all the problems we're dealing with. That's why A, the status quo is solving because we're actually pulling out, which maintains U.S. hegemony, but two, this triggers their argument because if there's U.S. weakness anywhere, it leads to conflict. Also, we'd say as long as the US shows its strength anywhere, it shows to other countries and they can't just encroach, which means their argument is very silly. At the end of the day, they are asking you to vote on the argument that says nuclear war is going to happen because of things like hotlines and the fact that if you send a nuclear weapon, other countries will send a nuclear weapon back. Nuclear war simply has never happened in the history of the United States and the globe. Do not vote for an argument that is so improbable. Finally, let's go to their argument on democratic dominoes. The first thing we tell you is from Rwanda 22 explains, Biden is already currently pursuing democracy across the Middle East, which promotes democracy at its core, and he's stepping up with vaccine diplomacy. Second, the CRS finds foreign leaders are often threatened by democracy promotion, which interferes with local governance and politics, which is why you make the situation a whole lot worse, and they're now emboldened to become more authoritarian. For all those reasons, so proud to negate.
You're the same. Is there like a doc for that?
Yeah. Give me a second. Well, are you cool if I put it in the folder?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, sounds good. Well, actually, I'll just share it as a link. That's shareable.
Wait, yeah. What folder are we talking about?
I'll just put in the Zoom chat as a viewer. So you can view it. We don't disclose, but we might disclose for prep. Very likely we will. Thank you, Joy. I agree. Okay, that's the link to the rebuttal. Are you good for cross?
Actually, I think just
Okay,
take a
prep.
little bit of prep before cross, and then we'll be good.
Okay, sounds good.
Oh, okay, that was another 10 seconds used. Good for cross. Sam, I'm good for cross.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that. Okay, you have the first question.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about your argument on sanctions. So
Yeah.
you say like they only get worse. How can they only get worse if they're already like in place to like their fullest extremes right now in the status quo?
Well, we'd say one, they aren't, and two, we'd say
Why not?
we have more incentive. Right, our argument is that in the future we would still sanction more countries. Right, if we're engaging in diplomacy, we say a mechanism of diplomacy would be more sanctions on other countries who are expanding diplomacy.
That's not necessarily how it works, right? Like, sure,
Why?
maybe diplomacy and sanctions may go hand in hand, but it doesn't mean it's like a scalar idea, right? If sanctions have already been in place, there's nothing else for us to sanction. Instead,
Yeah,
it probably
but-
necessitates a shift towards a more different approach because when you have
Ryan.
an increased diplomatic efforts, you're trying to do different things that you haven't already done before, probably things like foreign aid, for example.
Ryan, here's the issue with that. Right now, we are sanctioning some countries, but we aren't sanctioning all countries. We're saying that specifically in the Middle East.
okay,
Well, we
this
wouldn't
doesn't make a
sanction
lot
all
of sense,
countries,
right?
right? But
Why
I'm
don't
saying
we just, like,
countries we
throw a
do
bunch
not
of
sanction,
sanctions?
we would start sanctioning now.
Can you give an example of like a country we would just randomly sanction just for fun?
Well, not for fun. Like, if there's a conflict that's about to happen, like your argument says, we'd try to stop the conflict. And as we've seen in the Russian conflict right now, we use sanctions as a mechanism, which doesn't
Okay,
work.
first of all, like Russia is not comparable to the Middle East. And second of all, that's not necessarily what we try to do. What the U.S. is doing specifically right now when they try to do diplomacy is try to re-foster like partnerships with other countries. Definitely not trying to worsen relations. The only reason they put sanctions is on like conflicts that are like having like international crises that require like some form of like government change. But you can.
I mean, yeah, we'll contest that, but we'll take a question. Okay, let's go to Middle East hegemony, right? So this evidence that the Middle East is the linchpin, why is that not true for any other region?
Because the Middle East specifically has a lot of like very key partnerships that like a lot of others like. Can you give me an example like another?
Like
example?
I'm sure you did the Baltics topic. We read evidence that said the Baltics are linchpin for U.S. credibility, NATO credibility. Why is that not true?
Yeah, because like NATO credibility is different, right? There's always going to be European countries ensuring the like credibility of NATO, whereas specifically in the Middle East, it's not like a massive multilateral organization. Specifically, if the U.S. is not there, then it makes like those relations really, really weak because you don't have the assistance of other European countries to help us.
Okay, so the linchpin warrant is we need to be in a region because if we're not in a region, it shows we're weak there. Like
No,
we're
it's not
not
about
trying
that.
to
It's about
actually
having.
help other countries.
It's about the credibility of U.S. alliances, right? So it's the idea that if the U.S. doesn't have strong alliances with some very powerful countries, then it's going to like make countries like China and Russia more powerful. That triggers like a massive like kind of like power vacuum.
Sure. You know, question.
Okay, cool. So let me look at my flow. Let's talk about this whole argument on the idea that allies become more emboldened when the U.S. Like, what is the warrant as to why like countries become more aggressive when the U.S. is there?
I mean, I think it's pretty simple. When we are there in the Middle East, they know that we can back them up, and they know that, for example,
How does that
US
respond
can be a
to any of the
themselves.
analysis I gave that was maybe in the past during the era of the war on terror, but now the U.S. has specifically changed its posture to where they're not just trying to embolden allies, but rather they're taking a more supportive role.
So, okay, cross is over, but the analysis is pretty simple. Even if we are doing a supportive role, our link still gets triggered. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, we'll take some more.
Okay, that's prep. It's gonna start on our contention 2 about US hedge, a front line, and then I will go to their case. Is everyone good? Awesome. Okay. Our time starts now. At the end of the day, this round is really, really simple. Our contention 2 is by far the best place to vote. Our argument is really simple. Because the entire world is looking to the Middle East, what the United States does is really, really important. In fact, what they have conceded that ends the round is that any attempt by the United States to increase engagement in the Middle East increases our hegemony. It doesn't even have to produce tangible policy. Upkeeping our hegemony is really, really important because the rise of another hedge fund like China or Russia would lead to all of our allies lashing out in fear, proliferation, and war, which leads to lots of death and could lead to a nuclear war, which would lead to extinction. They say a couple of things. First, they say that allies are going to get emboldened by their case and alliances are going to fall apart. That's just their contention too, but they've also conceded that there's no diplomacy right now, so the only risk of solvency is aft. Secondly, they say that the United States is an aggressor and that we are really, really imperial, and that's bad. But our argument is not about the perception of the United States in the Middle East. We don't care what the Middle Eastern countries think. It's about global perception by China, Russia, and our allies. That's the link. That's what they miss. Then they say the hotlines are going to solve nuclear war. That literally isn't true. Not every country has hotlines with every other country. We see lots of proliferation by countries, like by other countries in Europe or other allies that are really scared. It's likely those hotlines don't ever get built, which is the link into nuclear war. You're always going to prefer our case on scope because, in fact, by far the most people, our arguments link it to a global war, which is a lot bigger than war that's specific to the Middle East. It affects more people, so you vote for us. Then you can go to their case. On their contention 1, they miss one really key idea. A second response that we read in rebuttal was that sanctions only fail because of lack of diplomacy. So increasing talks is the only way to make them work. Our O'Toole evidence concludes that sanctions only work when they're combined with broader diplomatic and political efforts. That's the missing key right now. The reason sanctions are failing is because we aren't doing enough diplomacy. So when you start doing diplomacy, the sanctions actually achieve their goals instead of just harming the poor. Then they give you a turn and say that we're giving aid to authoritarian governments. That's empirically not true. It's an uncarded assertion. Our evidence concludes that we're trying to help these countries' economies and help the poor. We're not trying to help the government. Go to their contention 2. At the top, remember the TNA evidence postdates all of their evidence and finds that there is absolutely no diplomacy right now, which means that the only risk of solvency is going to be in our world. Our evidence is specific to the Middle East and finds that regional organizations don't work as well. Secondly, they have conceded the analysis that the U.S. hasn't changed its posture. It's no longer picking sides or giving security guarantees. Instead, the Pomper evidence finds that the U.S. opens the door for third-party actors, which means the United States no longer picks sides. Instead, we're playing a supportive role, allowing the involved parties to delegate among themselves, which means that tensions actually decrease because countries are finally beginning to work together. Thus, it is a really clear affirmative ballot.
Cool. We'll take prep.
Cool. Once again, this is second summary for the con. All right, the order is going to be, I'll go my case and then theirs. Is anyone not ready? Great. Then I'll start my time right now. The cleanest place to vote in this round is our first contention. They don't attack any of the links. They go for a single turn. It's game over. Let's extend the argument. Our UN 20 evidence indicates that sanctions are an aspect of diplomacy that is widely used to punish nations. This is really bad because our Hania evidence writes that sanctions are detrimental to home countries by cutting them off from the international financial system, devastating their economy. This has already happened in Syria. Our Erfan evidence writes that even though we've had sanctions on Syria for 10 plus years, there have been no positive effects, while our Allen evidence writes that right now, 90% of the population is in poverty. At this point, you can vote for us right there. Even if you buy their turn that sanctions can be helpful under diplomacy, A, they haven't been in Syria, which means we still access 90% of their population, and B, there's no specific scenario analysis, which is why you always prefer our argument on clarity. But let's go to their turn regardless. I would ask them to name a single example of a country where sanctions have actually worked. Their evidence indicates that with diplomacy, they can be a whole lot better, but two things are true. A, our evidence still indicates that overall they're really, really bad. And B, even if they get better under diplomacy, they wouldn't exist in the first place if we didn't have diplomatic measures putting them there to begin with. At this point, even if you buy the response, you're still voting for us. Our entire link and impact scenario is 100% conceded, and it outweighs on clarity. You're voting for us there. On our C2, you probably don't even know what Ryan or Grant said in either speech here, because I don't. But even if you do want to go for their arguments, they just read uniqueness. It's not offense for them. Let's go over to their case. They make a huge mistake going for their C2. It's probably the only argument that they actually conceded defense on. Let's go there. They concede our turn that indicates that right now, insofar as the uniqueness flows neg because no countries are proliferating and there hasn't been a drop in credibility, even if you buy their link story, their impact hasn't happened yet, which means the only side that actually triggers any sort of nuclear conflict is actually the affirmative, as per the term that Sam puts on their case, which is that if we overstretch in the Middle East, we decrease our commitments abroad elsewhere, which means we are the only risk that there's actually a decrease in credibility and an increase in proliferation. It's game over there. Grant didn't even frontline that. But even if you don't want to buy that, you can go to the impact level. Even if you don't want to vote for us on our conceded turn, there's still terminal defense. They attack the hotline scenario, but concede Sam's defense scenario that writes that even if countries do have access to nuclear missiles and they do proliferate, they never use them because they always have the risk of being nuked back, which means even if you do buy their argument, there's no terminal impact. At the end of the day, they have made this round super messy, but all of their responses are super, super easy to understand. The points they make on our case aren't interactive with our link. At this point, we outweigh on clarity. The unique list flows to the neg insofar as their case isn't happening, but ours is. At this point, we outweigh on probability. But third, even if you do want to buy their argument, we're still outweighing on magnitude because we have turned their link scenario to begin with. Remember, if no country is nuclearizing right now, the only risk in which it actually happens is if something changes, and that only happens when you affirm it. If you want to save lives, negate.
Do we want to do Grand Cross or skip?
I said let's do Grand Cross.
Grand Cross? Okay, let's have some fun.
Okay.
All right, y'all can have the first question.
Okay, so is the United States currently doing diplomacy with the Syrian government at the same time as we're doing sanctions? Right, in the Syrian conflict, right? You say that sanctions are fair.
Like right now?
Yeah, are we attempting to do diplomacy along with our sanctions? Right, because our argument is you need diplomacy and sanctions for the sanctions to work. So are we currently doing diplomacy with our sanctions?
Well, two things are true. Even if we're not doing it, I'd say A, we've probably done diplomacy at some point in the past 10 years and it hasn't worked. And B, even if we haven't done diplomacy, that still doesn't interact with our scenario on Syria. We say the reason for adding more sanctions is diplomacy, which means if you boost diplomatic efforts, you don't have Syria in the first place.
Wait. How does that make any sense? How can we add more sanctions on Syria? They're already sanctioned.
Well, it doesn't have to be that. Like, we can win this scenario, but we're also winning the idea that sanctions are a part of diplomacy. As long as you can see that link, we are winning 100% probability that in the future we also sanction other countries. Can we have a question?
Sure.
Cool. Let's talk about Middle East hegemony. So we agree right now, no countries are proliferating, right?
Sure, but our evidence concludes that the United States currently has no strategy for the Middle East.
Sure.
Really bad going into the future.
So let's look at your impact scenario. Who would proliferate, and then who would launch the nuke?
Our allies. Right.
Our allies would
proliferate.
launch the nuke.
No, so our allies are likely to proliferate, which increases the chance that a nuclear weapon gets used.
Okay, like which allies?
I mean, like Japan, South Korea, for example. I don't know.
Okay, Japan and South Korea nuclearize and then launch a nuke towards who? Like just out of nowhere.
So specifically what our argument is like things like the risk of proliferation causes the risk of war. For example, maybe there's like a risk of South Korea and Japan proliferating. That scares China. That caused the escalation. Or China could just become more aggressive overall. Places like Taiwan, that also risks the nuclear scenario.
The internal link into all those scenarios is that there's a sense that the U.S. credibility is decreasing, right? And U.S. strength is decreasing. So they're insecure.
Yeah. Sure, yeah.
Okay, we'll agree on that. You can have a question.
I don't have any question. Yeah, well.
Julian, I'm sure you'd like to take a question.
Oh, sure. I'd love to take a question.
Great.
All right. So, all right. So, say we give you the best case scenario on diplomacy, right? On diplomacy and sanctions, right? Even if we do agree that the reason sanctions don't work is because of diplomacy or because of a lack of diplomacy, you don't extend any reason as to why sanctions are good. So why does it even matter?
The warranty is the same, right? It's like the warranty as to why sanctions are bad is because they cause like these economic problems, right? So when we have effective sanctions, what it does is it causes like the government to actually do change, which is what caused like the sanctions to end, and that's what caused like the reforms in the government.
The effect of sanctions working is that the sanctions go away, which is your impact.
Right, but those sanctions wouldn't have been in place in the first place.
Well, you're not in the alternative, right? So if the sanctions were in place, there would be like mass atrocities because the government is
no, I don't think so. But
we don't have any evidence of that.
Right? Okay, that's time.
All right, is everyone good? Or actually, take a little bit of prep. All right, so the order is going to be our case weighing their case. Pretty simple. The easiest place to vote is our contention 2. Our argument is simple because the entire world is looking to the Middle East. What the U.S. does is really important. In fact, what they have conceded that ends around that any attempt by the U.S. to engage, increase our hegemony. It doesn't even have to produce policy outcome. Our hegemony is really important because the rise of another hegemon will lead to our allies lashing out with proliferation and war to fear, which leads to a lot of death and to lead to eventually nuclear war. They have a couple of responses. The first thing they say is, so we can see this idea about overstretch. But no, they have conceded our analysis. All the analysis we do is that the idea that we have changed our posture when it comes to Middle East. What they have conceded on their C2 is the idea that we're not taking an interventionist role. Instead, we're taking a very supportive role in conducting diplomacy in the Middle East, which means there is no risk of overstretch. At that point where that analysis is conceded, it means there's no access to the turn, and it definitely wasn't implicated this way in rebuttal. Second of all, they also concede that they say that we have conceded the idea that there's going to be this massive nuclear war scenario, but they have conceded the idea that it's these countries feel like there's like an existential risk. They're not going to care about the risk of them being nuked back because they feel like in either world, the country's security is going to be at risk, which is why they feel a need to go to nuclear weapons in the first place because it's the only way that they can actually gain, like they can actually win the war, which means there's no risk of them like feeling a war of mutually assured destruction. At that point, none of the responses really are that response to our argument. They try to be some blippy warranting, but there's no reason to why clarity or probability necessarily matters and why they have better clarity or probability than us, I would say all those things are very subjective in nature. The last scenario is the idea about magnitude, but at the point where they have conceded all the analysis that we're definitely not being overstretched because we're taking a supportive role, not an interventionist role, they have no access to any turns. At that point, we have a huge link into extinction, which definitely outweighs all their scenarios on magnitude because sanctions only affect a couple million people. At that point, you can go to their case. They lose the round when they have some really bad frontline to their argument in Syria. They just say that sanctions have no positive effects in Syria. That's exactly their argument. Our argument is that sanctions have failed for the past 10 years because we haven't coupled them diplomacy. But when we do diplomacy, we can have better relations with the Syrian government, which ultimately leads to the end of these sanctions and causes the government to actually reform and helps the people in the region producing economic benefits. The alternative is a world when we don't have these things and the governments do massive atrocities. The only way we can actually get the help of these people is when we have diplomacy, which can actually share better relations with these countries.
Okay, cool. We'll take a bit of prep. Okay. The order is pretty simple. It's going to be our case, then their case. Time will start now. The round is over when you have to choose between a 100% probable link into millions of people into poverty versus a 0.0001% risk of extinction occurring. Let's go to our case. The first thing and the only response they say is that we can use diplomacy to solve for sanctions, but the comparative is conceded in every single speech that in a world where we didn't use diplomacy to use sanctions in the first place, sanctions wouldn't have been imposed in the first place. They are only trying to solve a problem that they created. Let's go to our argument. The UN evidence is conceded that sanctions are one of the most common tools for international diplomacy trying to coerce other countries. And Hass098 explains these sanctions destroy entire economies, which is why in Syria 90% of people remain below the poverty line. All of that analysis conceded. We show you a scenario that has not worked in the past, but B, we tell you in the future it's a whole lot worse. At that point, this argument is 100% conceded, and every single link story and impact story is also conceded. But why are we winning the round on this? First, I'd argue as long as we are winning a reason why people fall into poverty and there's economic inequality, it's also a reason why states are unstable and it shows that the US credibility is low. But moreover, on their case, they're losing this round here. First, our argument from summary is conceded, and there's imperial overstretch when we expand into the Middle East. They read a new response, and all of a sudden our posture changes to a non-interventionist approach, but a supportive approach is still one that requires US effort, which is why in the status quo, you can look to their argument. If their argument is true, we should be seeing proliferation, US insecurity, and other states proliferating, but not a single one of those items is happening. US security is strong, and no country is proliferating. That only gets worse in their world, where you go into the Middle East, use diplomats, for example, and overstretch ourselves, we just care about too many things. At that point, what they also agree and cross is that the reason why countries proliferate is because of insecurity. If we lose wars because we are too overstretched, that is the biggest source of insecurity. Finally, they say that there are existential risks, but again, what we tell you is that things like mutually assured destruction ensures that a nuclear war is never going to happen. At the end of this round, they haven't listed a single actor that would strike our allies. At that point, there is no risk of nuclear war, and there will never be so. Vote for the probable link into our sanctions happening and millions into poverty. All right, good on y'all.
Right.
Great round. Thank you so much. All right, Sam, is there anything we want to finish up by saying for the demo round? I mean, I think that was a really great round.
Okay, just finish. Thank God.
We're done. All good.
Yeah, we're done. Okay,
Well,
I think.
literally started in the nick of time.
I think.
nothing's
Wait, if you look at the
happening.
schedule. Hi, Allison. If you look at the schedule, we have like a couple minutes just to chill. You can go to your lab or just take a quick break. And you'll debrief the round a little bit in your lab.
Right. So let's, I don't know, take a break, chill for a bit, and then what do we say, like 9:20? At 9:20, I'll open up the breakout rooms. But thank you so much to the instructors and to the debaters to debating. That was a great round. Thank you.
All right, good stuff.